7. Silo 17. Juliet flicked the lights on in the suit lab as she hauled in her latest load from supply. Unlike Solo, she didn't take the constant source of power for granted. Not knowing where it came from made her nervous that it wouldn't last. So while he had the habit, the compulsion even, of turning every light on to full and leaving it there, she tried to conserve the mysterious energy as much as possible. She dropped her recent scavenges on her cot, thinking of Walker as she did so. Is this how he ended up living amongst his work? Was it the obsession, the drive, the need to keep hammering away at a series of never-ending problems until he couldn't sleep more than a few paces from them? The more she understood the old man, the farther away from him she felt, the lonelier. She sat down and rubbed her legs, her thighs and calves tight from the most recent hike up. She may have been gaining her porter legs these last weeks, but they were still sore all the time, the ache in them a constant new sensation. Squeezing the muscles transformed that ache into pain, which she somehow preferred. The sharp and definable sensations were better than the dull and nameless kind. She liked feeling things she could understand. Juliet kicked her boots off, strange to think of these scavenged things as hers, and stood up. That was enough rest. It was as much rest as she could allow herself to have. She carried her canvas sacks to one of the fancy workbenches, everything in the suit lab nicer than what she'd had in mechanical. Even the parts engineered to fail were constructed with a level of chemical and engineering sophistication she could only begin to appreciate now that she understood their evil intent. She had amassed piles of washers and seals, the good from supply and the leftover bad from the lab, to see how the system worked. They sat along the back of her main workbench, a reminder of the diabolical murderousness with which she'd been sent away. She dumped out the parts from supply and thought about how strange it was to have access to live in this forbidden heart of some other silo. It was stranger still to appreciate these workbenches, these immaculate tools, all arranged for the purpose of sending people like her to their death. Looking around at the walls, at the dozen or so cleaning suits hanging from racks in various states of repair, it was like living and working in a room full of ghostly apparitions. If one of these suits jumped down and started moving about on its own, it wouldn't surprise her. The arms and legs on each one were puffy, as if full, the mirrored visors easily concealing curious faces. It was like having company, these hanging forms. They watched her, impassively, while she sorted her finds into two piles. One of items she needed for her next big project, the other of useful tidbits she had snagged with no specific idea of what she might use them for. A valuable, rechargeable battery went in this second group, some blood still on it that she hadn't been able to wipe off. Images flashed through her mind of some of the scenes she'd found while scrounging for materials, like the two men who had committed suicide in the head office of supply. Their hands interlocked, opposite wrists slit, a rust-colored stain all around them. This was one of the worst scenes, a memory she couldn't shake. There were other evidences of violence scattered about the silo. The entire place was haunted and marred. She completely understood why Solo limited his rounds to the gardens. She also empathized with his habit of blocking off the server room every night with the filing cabinet, even though he had been alone for years. If someone hadn't long ago fried the electronic keypad that activated the locks on that door, he would probably be employing it to come and go. Juliet didn't blame him. She slid the deadbolts on the suit lab every night before she went to sleep. She didn't really believe in ghosts, but that conviction was being sorely tested by the constant feeling of being watched by, if not actual people, the silo itself. She began her work on the air compressor, and, as always, it felt good to be doing something with her hands. fixing something, staying distracted. The first few nights, after surviving the horrible ordeal of being sent to clean, of fighting her way inside this carcass of a silo, she had searched, long and hard, for some place that she could actually sleep. It was never going to be below the server room, not with the stench of Solo's debris piles pervading the place. She tried the apartments for IT's head, but thoughts of Bernard made it impossible to even sit still. The couches in various offices weren't long enough. The pad she'd tried to put together on the warm server floor was nice, but the clicking and whirring of all those tall cabinets nearly drove her insane. The suit lab, strangely enough, with the specters and ghouls hanging about, was the only spot where she'd won a decent night of sleep. It was probably the tools everywhere, the welders and wrenches, the walls of drawers full of every socket and driver imaginable. If she was going to fix anything, even herself, it was there in that room. The only other place she'd felt at home in Silo 17 was in the 2 jail cells she sometimes slept in on trips up and down. There, and sitting behind that empty server, talking to Lucas. She thought about him as she crossed the room to grab the right-sized tap from one of the expansive metal tool chests. She pocketed this and pulled down one of the complete cleaning suits, admiring the heft of the outfit, remembering how bulky it had felt when she'd worn one just like it. She lifted it onto a clear workbench and pulled off the helmet's locking collar, took this to the drill press and carefully bored a starter hole. With the collar in a vise, she began working the tap into the hole, creating new threads for the air hose. She was wrestling with this and thinking about her last conversation with Lucas when the smell of fresh bread preceded Solo into the lab. "Hello," he called from the doorway. Juliet looked up and jerked her chin for him to enter. Turning the tap required effort, the metal handle digging into her palms, sweat forming on her brow. "I baked more bread." "Smells great," she grunted. Ever since she'd taught Solo how to bake flatbread, she couldn't get him to stop. The large tins of flour that had been holding up his canned goods shelves were being removed one at a time while he experimented with recipes. She reminded herself to teach him more things to cook, to put this industriousness of his to good use by having him mix it up a little. "And I sliced cucumbers," he said, proud as if it were a feast beyond compare. In so many ways, Solo was stuck with the mind of a teenager, culinary habits included. "I'll have some in a bit," she told him. With effort, she finally got the tap all the way through the pilot hole, creating a threaded connection as neat as if it had come from supply. The tap backed out easily, just like a fitted bolt would. Solo placed the plate of bread and vegetables on the workbench and grabbed a stool. "What you working on? Another pump?" He peered at the large wheeled air compressor with the hoses trailing off it. "No, that was going to take too long. I'm working on a way to breathe underwater." Solo laughed. He started munching on a piece of bread until he realized she was serious. "Oh, you're serious?" "I am. The pumps we really need are in the sump basins at the very bottom of the silo. I just need to get some of this electricity from IT down to them. We'll have the place dry in weeks or months instead of years." "Breathe underwater?" he said. He looked at her like she was the one losing her mind. "It's no different than how I got here from my silo." She wrapped the male end of the air hose coupler with silicone tape, then began threading it into the collar. "These suits are airtight, which makes them watertight. All I need is a constant supply of air to breathe, and I can work down there as long as I like. Long enough to get the pumps going, anyway." "Wow, you think they'll still work?" "They should." She grabbed a wrench and tightened the coupler as hard as she dared. "They're designed to be submerged, and they're simple. They just need power, which we've got plenty of up here." "Well, what will I do?" Solo wiped his hands, sprinkling breadcrumbs on her workbench. He reached for another piece. "You'll be watching the compressor. I'll show you how to crank it, how to top it with fuel. I'm going to install one of the portable deputy radios in the helmet, here, so we can talk back and forth. There'll be a whole mess of hose and electrical wire to play out." She smiled up at him. "Don't worry, I'll keep you busy." "Oh, I'm not worried," Solo said. He puffed out his chest and crunched on a cucumber, his eyes drifting to the compressor. And Juliet saw, just like a teenager with little practice but great need, that Solo had not yet mastered the art of lying convincingly. (8) Silo 18. Boys from the other side of the camp. These results were closely observed by the experimenters, who were posing as camp counselors. When the violence got out of hand, the experiment was halted before it could run its full course. What began at Robber Cave as 2 sets of boys, all with nearly identical backgrounds and values, had turned into what became known in the field of psychology as an in-grouping and out-grouping scenario. Small perceived differences, the way one wore a hat, the inflections in speech, turned into unforgivable transgressions. When stones started flying and the raids on each other's camps turned bloody, there was no recourse for the experimenters but to put an end to. Lucas couldn't read anymore. He closed the book and leaned back against the tall shelves. He smelled something foul, brought the spine of the old book to his nose and sniffed. It was him, he finally decided. When was the last time he'd showered? His routine was all out of whack. There were no screaming kids to wake him up in the morning, no evenings hunting for stars, no dimmed stairwell to guide him back to his bed so he could repeat it all the following day. Instead, it was fitful periods of tossing and turning in the hidden bunkroom of level 35. A dozen bunks, but him all alone. It was flashing red lights to signal that he had company, conversations with Bernard and Peter Billings when they brought him food, long talks with Juliet whenever she called and he was free to answer. Between it all, the books. Books of history out of order, of billions of people, of even more stars. Stories of violence, of the madness of crowds, of the staggering timeline of life, of orbited suns that would one day burn out, of weapons that could end it all, of diseases that nearly had. How long could he go on like this? Reading and sleeping and eating? The weeks already felt like months. There was no keeping track of the days, no way to remember how long he'd had on this pair of coveralls, if it was time to change out of them and into the pair in the dryer. Sometimes he felt like he changed and washed his clothes 3 times a day. It could easily have been twice a week. It smelled like longer. He leaned his head back against the tins of books and closed his eyes. The things he was reading couldn't all be true. It made no sense. A world so crowded and strange. When he considered the scale of it all, the idea of this life burrowed beneath the earth, sending people to clean, getting worked up over who stole what from whom, he sometimes felt a sort of mental vertigo, this frightening terror of standing over some abyss, seeing a dark truth far below, but unable to make it out before his senses returned and reality snatched him back from the edge. He wasn't sure how long he sat like that, dreaming of a different time and place, before he realized the throbbing red lights had returned. Lucas returned the book to its tin and struggled to his feet. The computer screen showed Peter Billings at the server door, as deep as he was allowed into the room. A tray with Lucas's dinner sat on top of the work log filing cabinet inside the door. He turned away from the computer, hurried down the corridor, and scrambled up the ladder. After removing the grate, he carefully dropped it back into place and picked a circuitous path through the tall humming servers. Here's our little protege. Peter smiled, but his eyes narrowed at the sight of Lucas. Lucas dipped his chin. "Sheriff?" he said. He always had this sense that Peter was silently mocking him, looking down on him, even though they were about the same age. Whenever he showed up with Bernard, especially the day Bernard had explained the need to keep Lucas safe, there had seemed some sort of competitive tension between them. A tension Lucas was aware of, even if he didn't share it. In private, Bernard had committed Lucas to secrecy and told him that he was grooming Peter for the eventual job of mayor, that he and Lucas would one day work hand in hand. Lucas tried to remember this as he slid the tray off the cabinet. Peter watched him, his brow lowered in thought. Lucas turned to go.
"Oh, why don't you sit here and eat?"
Peter asked, not budging from where he leaned against the thick server room door. Lucas froze.
"I see you sitting here with Bernard while you eat, but you're always in a hurry to scurry off when I come by."
Peter leaned out and peered into the stacks of servers.
"What is it you do in here all day, anyway?"
Lucas felt trapped. In truth, he wasn't even all that hungry, had thought about saving it for later, but eating his food to completion was usually the fastest way out of these conversations. He shrugged and sat down on the floor, leaned against the worklog cabinet, and stretched his legs out in front of him. Uncovering the tray revealed a bowl of unidentifiable soup, 2 slices of tomato, and a piece of cornbread. "I work on the servers mostly, just like before." He started with a bite of the bread, something bland. "Only difference is I don't have to walk home at the end of the day." He smiled at Peter while he chewed the dry bread.
"Well, that's right. You live down in the mids, don't you?"
Peter crossed his arms and seemed to get even more comfortable against the thick door. Lucas leaned to the side and gazed past him down the hallway. Voices could be heard around the corner. He had a sudden impulse to get up and run, just for the sake of running.
"Barely,"
he answered. "My apartment's practically in the uptop."
"All the mids are,"
Peter laughed,
"to those who live there."
Lucas worked on the cornbread to keep his mouth occupied. He eyed the soup warily while he chewed.
"Did Bernard tell you about the big assault we've got planned? I was thinking of going down to take part."
Lucas shook his head. He dipped his spoon into the soup.
"You know that wall Mechanical built? How those idiots boxed themselves in? Well, Sims and his boys are going to blast it to smithereens. They've had all the time in the world to work on it from our side, so this little rebellion nonsense should be over in a few days, max."
Slurping the hot soup, all Lucas could think about was the men and women of Mechanical trapped behind that wall of steel, and how he knew precisely what they were going through.
"Does that mean I'll be out of here soon?"
He pressed the edge of his spoon into an underripe tomato rather than use the knife and fork.
"There can't be any threat out there for me, can there? Nobody even knows who I am." "Oh, that's up to Bernard. He's been acting strange lately. A lot of stress, I suppose."
Peter slid down the door and rested on his heels. It was nice for Lucas to not have to crane his neck to look up at him.
"He did say something about bringing your mother up for a visit. I took that to mean you might be in here at least a week longer."
"Great." Lucas pushed his food around some more. When the distant server started buzzing, his body practically jerked as if tugged by some string. The overhead lights winked faintly, meaningful to those in the know.
"What's that?"
Peter peered into the server room, rising on his toes a little.
"That means I need to get back to work."
Lucas handed him the tray. "Thanks for bringing this." He turned to go.
"Hey, the mayor said to make sure you ate everything."
Lucas waved over his shoulder. He disappeared around the first tall server and began to jog toward the back of the room, wiping his mouth with his hand, knowing Peter couldn't follow.
"Lucas!"
But he was gone. He hurried toward the far wall, digging his keys out of his collar as he went. While he worked on the locks, he saw the overhead lights stop their flashing. Peter had closed the door. He removed the back panel and dug the headphones out of their pouch, plugged them in. "Hello?" He adjusted his microphone, making sure it wasn't too close. "Hey." Her voice filled him up in a way mere food couldn't. "Did I make you run?" Lucas took a deep breath. He was getting out of shape living in such confinement, not walking to and from work every day.
No, he lied. "But maybe you should go easy with the calling. At least during the day, you know who is in here all the time. Yesterday, when you let it ring so long, we were sitting right beside the server while it buzzed and buzzed. It really pissed him off.
You think I care if he gets angry? Juliet laughed. And I want him to answer. I'd love to talk to him some more. Besides, what would you suggest? I want to talk to you. I need to talk to someone. And you're always right there. It's not like you can call me and expect me to be here waiting. Hell, I'm all over the damn place over here. You know how many times I've been from the 30s to supply in the last week? Guess. I don't want to guess. Lucas rubbed his eyelids. Probably a half-dozen times. And you know, if he's in there all the time, you could just do me a favor and kill him for me. Save me all this trouble. Kill him? Lucas waved his arm. What, just bludgeon him to death? Do you really want some pointers? Because I've dreamt up a number of... No, I don't want pointers. And I don't want to kill anybody. I never did. Lucas dug his index finger into his temple and rubbed in tiny, forceful circles. These headaches were forever popping up. They had been ever since... Forget it, Juliet said, the disgust in her voice zipping through the wires at the speed of light. Look. Lucas readjusted his mic. He hated these conversations. He preferred it when they just talked about nothing. I'm sorry, it's just that things are crazy over here. I don't know who's doing what. I'm in this box with all this information. I've got this radio that just blares people fighting all the time, and yet I seem to know rat shit compared to everyone else. But you know you can trust me, right? That I'm one of the good guys? I didn't do anything wrong to be sent away, Lucas. I need you to know that. He listened as Juliet took in a deep breath and let it out with a sigh. He imagined her sitting over there, alone in that silo with a crazy man, the mic pressed to her lips, her chest heaving with exasperation, her mind full of all these expectations of him. Lucas, you do know that I'm on the right side here, don't you? And that you're working for an insane man? Everything's crazy, he said. Everyone is. I do know this. We were sitting here in IT, hoping nothing bad would happen, and the worst things we could think of came to us. Juliet released another deep breath, and Lucas thought about what he had told her of the uprising, the things he had omitted. I know what you say my people did, but do you understand why they came? Do you? Something needed to be done, Luke. It still needs doing. Lucas shrugged, forgetting she couldn't see him. As often as they chatted, he still wasn't used to conversing with someone like this. You're in a position to help, she told him. I didn't ask to be here. He felt himself growing frustrated. Why did their conversations have to drift off to bad places? Why couldn't they go back to talking about the best meals they'd ever had, their favorite books as kids, the likes and annoyances they had in common? None of us asked to be where we are, she reminded him coolly. This gave Lucas pause, thinking of where she was, what she'd been through to get there. What we control, Juliet said, is our actions once fate puts us there. I probably need to get off. Lucas took a shallow breath. He didn't want to think of actions and fate. He didn't want to have this conversation. Pete'll be bringing me my dinner soon, he lied. There was silence. He could hear her breathing. It was almost like listening to someone think. Okay, she said. I understand. I need to go test the suit anyway, and hey, I might be gone a while if this thing works, so if you don't hear from me for a day or so... Just be careful, Lucas said. I will. And remember what I said, Luke. What we do going forward defines who we are. You aren't one of them. You don't belong there. Please, don't forget this. Lucas mumbled his agreement, and Juliet said goodbye, her voice still in his ears as he reached in and unplugged the jack. Rather than slot the headphones into their pouch, he slumped back against the server behind him, wringing the ear pads in his hands, thinking about what he had done, about who he was. He felt like curling up into a ball and crying, just closing his eyes and making the world go away. But he knew, if he closed them, if he allowed himself to sink into darkness, all he would see there is her. That small woman with the gray hair, her body jumping from the impacts of the bullets, Lucas's bullets. He would feel his finger on the trigger, his cheeks wet with salt, the stench of spent powder, the table ringing with the clink of empty brass and with the jubilant and victorious cries of the men and women he had aligned himself with. "9. Silo 18.
Said Thursday that I get it to you in 2 days. Well, damn it, it's been 2 days, Carl. You do realize the cleaning's tomorrow morning, right? And you realize that today is still today, don't you? Don't be a smartass. Get me that file and get it up here pronto. I swear, if this shit falls through because you were... I'll bring it. Come on, man. I'm busting your balls. Relax. Relax? Screw you. I'll relax tomorrow. I'm getting off the line. Now don't dick around. I'm coming right now.
Shirley held the sides of her head, her fingers tangled in her hair, elbows digging into Walker's workbench. "What in the depths is going on?" she asked him. "Walk, what is this? Who are these people?" Walker peered through his magnifiers. He dipped the single bristle plucked from the cleaning brush into the white paint on the wet lid of primer. With utmost care, his other hand steadying his wrist, he dragged the bristle across the outside of the potentiometer directly opposite the fixed mark he'd painted on the knob itself. Satisfied, he counted the ticks he'd made so far, each one marking the position of another strong signal.
11,
he said. He turned to Shirley, who had been saying something, he wasn't sure what.
"And I don't think we've found ours yet."
"Ours? Walk, this is freaking me out. Where are these voices coming from?" He shrugged.
"The city? Over the hills? How should I know?"
He started spinning the knob slowly, listening for more chatter.
11 besides us. Ooh, what if there's more? There has to be more, right? What are the chances we've found them all already?
That last one was about a cleaning. Do you think they meant, like... Walker nodded, sending his magnifiers out of whack. He readjusted them, then went back to tuning the dial. So they're in silos? Like us. He pointed to the tiny green board she'd helped him wire the potentiometer to.
It must be what this circuit does. Modulates the wave frequency, maybe.
Shirley was freaking out over the voices. He was more fascinated in these other mysteries. There was a crackle of static. He paused in turning the knob, scrubbed back and forth across it, but found nothing. He moved on. You mean the little board with the number 18 on it? Walker looked at her dumbly. His fingers stopped their searching. He nodded. So there's at least that many, she said, putting it together quicker than he had. I've got to find Jenkins. We've got to tell him about this. Shirley left her stool and headed for the door. Walker bobbed his head. The implications made him dizzy, the bench and walls seeming to slide sideways. The idea of people beyond these walls. A violent roar rattled his teeth and shook the thought loose. His feet slipped out from underneath him as the ground trembled, decades of dust raining down from the tangle of pipes and wires crisscrossing overhead. Walker rolled to his side, coughing, breathing the musky mildew drifting in the air. His ears were ringing from the blast. He patted his head, groping for his magnifiers, when he saw the frame lying on the steel decking before him, the lens broken into gravel-sized shards.
Oh no! I need...
He tried to get his hands underneath him, felt a twinge in his hip, a powerful ache where bone had smacked steel. He couldn't think. He waved his hand, begging Scotty to come out of the shadows and help him. A heavy boot crunched what remained of his magnifiers. Strong, young hands gripped his coveralls, pulling him to his feet. There was shouting everywhere, the pop and rattle of gunfire.
"Walk, you okay?"
Jenkins held him by his coveralls. Walker was pretty sure he would collapse if the boy let go.
"My magna—" "Sir, we've got to go. They are inside."
Walker turned toward the door, saw Harper helping Shirley to her feet. Her eyes were wide, stunned, a film of gray dust on her shoulders and in her dark hair. She was looking toward Walker, appearing as senseless as he felt.
"Get your things," Jenkins said. "We're falling back."
He scanned the room, eyes drifting to the workbench.
"I fixed it,"
Walker said, coughing into his fist.
"It works." "A little too late, I think."
Jenkins let go of his coveralls, and Walker had to catch himself on his stool to not go tumbling back to the ground. The gunfire outside drew nearer. Boots thundered by, more shouting, another loud blast that could be felt through the floor. Jenkins and Harper were at the doorway shouting orders and waving their arms at the people running past. Shirley joined Walker at his workbench. Her eyes were on the radio. "We need this," she said, breathing hard. Walker looked down at the glittering jewels on the floor. 2 months' wages for those magnifiers. "Walk! What do I grab? Help me!" He turned to find Shirley gathering up the radio parts, the wires between the boards folded up, tangled. There was a single loud pop from one of the good guns right outside his door, causing him to cower, his mind to wander. "Look! The antenna!" he whispered, pointing to where the dust was still drifting from the rafters. Shirley nodded and jumped up on his workbench. Walker looked around the room, a room he promised himself he would never leave again, a promise he really had meant to keep this time. What to grab? Stupid mementos, junk, dirty clothes, a pile of schematics? He grabbed his parts bin and dumped it out on the floor. The radio components were swept in, the transformer unplugged from its outlet and added. Shirley was yanking down the antenna, the wires and metal rods bundled against her chest. He snatched his soldering iron, a few tools. Harper yelled that it was now or never. Shirley grabbed Walker by the arm and pulled him along toward the door. And Walker realized it was going to be never. Silo 17. The panic she felt from donning the suit was unexpected. Juliet had anticipated some degree of fear from slipping into the water, but it was the simple act of putting on the cleaning suit that filled her with a hollow dread, that gave her a cold and empty ache in the pit of her stomach. She fought to control her breathing while Solo zipped up the back and pressed the layers of Velcro into place. "Where's my knife?" she asked him, patting the pockets on the front and searching among her tools.
"It's over here,"
he said. He bent down and fished it out of her gear bag, out from under a towel and change of clothes. He passed her the knife, handle first, and Juliet slotted it into the thick pocket she'd added on the suit's belly. It was easier to breathe, just having it within reach. This tool from the upper cafe was like a security blanket of sorts. She found herself checking for it the way she used to check her wrist for that old watch. "Let's wait on the helmet," she told Solo as he lifted the clear dome from the landing. "Grab that rope first." She pointed with her puffy mitts. The thick material and the 2 layers of undersuit were making her warm. She hoped that boded well for not freezing to death in the deep water. Solo lifted the coils of spliced rope. A large adjustable wrench the length of his forearm knotted at the end.
"Which side?"
he asked. She pointed to where the gracefully curving steps plunged into the green-lit water. "Lower it over steady, and hold it out so it doesn't get caught on the steps below." He nodded. Juliet checked her tools while he dropped the wrench into the water. the weight of the hunk of metal tugging the rope straight down to the very bottom of the great stairwell. In one pocket, she had a range of drivers. Each one was tied off with a few feet of string. She had a spanner in another pocket, cutters behind pocket number 4. Looking down at herself, more memories flooded back from her walk outside. She could hear the sound of fine grit pelting her helmet, could sense her air supply running thin, could feel the clomp of her heavy boots on the packed earth. She gripped the railing ahead of her and tried to think of something else, anything else. Wire for power and hose for air. Concentrate. She would need a lot of both. She took a deep breath and checked the tall coils of tubing and electrical wire laid out on the deck. She had flaked them in figure 8s so they would be impossible to tangle. Good. The compressor was ready. All Solo had to do was make sure everything fed down to her, didn't get caught up. "It's on the bottom," Solo said. Electrical wire laid out on the deck. She had flaked them in figure 8s so they would be impossible to tangle. Good. The compressor was ready. All Solo had to do was make sure everything fed down to her, didn't get caught up. "It's on the bottom," Solo said. She watched him knot the line to the stairway railing. He was in good spirits today, lucid and energetic. This would be a good time to get it over with. Shifting the flood to the treatment plant would have been an inelegant temporary solution. It was time to get those big pumps down below churning through that water properly, pumping it through the concrete walls and back into the earth beyond. Juliet shuffled to the edge of the landing and looked down at the silvery surface of the foul water. Was this plan of hers crazy? Shouldn't she be afraid? Or was it the years of waiting and doing this safely that was more terrifying to her? The prospect of going mad, inch by inch, seemed the greater risk. This would be just like going outside, she reminded herself, which she had already done and had survived. Except this was safer. She was taking an unlimited supply of air, and there was nothing toxic down there, nothing to eat away at her. She gazed at her reflection in the still water, the bulky suit making her look enormous. If Lucas were standing there with her, if he could see what she was about to do, would he try to talk her out of it? She thought he might. How well did they really know each other? They had, 2, 3 encounters in person? But then there were the dozens of talks since. Could she know someone from just his voice? From stories about his childhood? From his intoxicating laughter when everything else in her day made her want to cry? Was this why wires and emails were made expensive, to prevent this kind of life, this kind of relationship? How could she be standing there, thinking of a man she hardly knew, rather than the insanity of the task before her? Maybe Lucas had become her lifeline, some slender thread of hope connecting her to home. Or was he more like a tiny spot of light seen occasionally through the murk, a beacon guiding her return? "Helmet?" Solo stood beside her, watching her, the clear plastic dome in his hands, a single flashlight strapped to its top. Juliet reached for it. She made sure the flashlight was securely fastened and tried to clear her head of pointless ruminations. Hook up my air first," she said, "and turn on the radio." He nodded. He held the dome while he clicked the air hose into the adapter she'd threaded through the collar. There was a hiss and spit of residual air from the line as it locked into place. His hand brushed the back of her neck as he reached in to flick on the radio. Juliet dipped her chin, squeezing the handmade switch sewn into her undersuit. "Hello, hello," she said. There was a strange squeal from the unit on Solo's hip as her voice blared out of it. "It's a little loud," he said, adjusting his volume. She lifted the dome into place. It had been stripped of its screen and all the plastic linings. Once she'd scraped the paint off the exterior, she was left with an almost completely transparent half-sphere of tough plastic. It felt good to know, clicking it into the collar, that whatever she saw out of it was really there. "You good?" Solo's voice was deadened by the airtight connection between the helmet and the suit. She lifted her glove and gave him a thumbs up. She pointed to the compressor. He nodded, knelt down by the unit, and scratched his beard. She watched him flick the portable unit's main power, push the priming bulb 5 times, then yank the starting cord. The little unit spat out a breath of smoke and whirred to life. Even with its rubber tires, it danced and rattled the landing, sending vibrations up through her boots. Juliet could hear the awful acoustics through her helmet, could imagine the violent racket echoing up through the abandoned silo. Solo held the choke an extra second, just like she'd shown him, and then pushed it all the way in. While the machine pattered and chugged, he looked up at her, smiling through his beard, looking like one of the dogs in Supply staring up at its faithful owner. She pointed to the red can of extra gas and gave him another thumbs up. He returned the gesture. Juliet shuffled toward the steps, her gloved hand on the railing for balance. Solo squeezed past and went to the railing and the knotted rope. He held out a hand to steady her while she lumbered down the slippery treads in the suit's clunky boots. Her hope was that it would be easier to move once she was in the water, but she had no way of knowing, just an intuitive feel for the physics of it all, the way she could gauge a machine's intent simply by poring over it. She took the last dry steps, and then her boots broke the oily surface of the water and found the step below. She waded down 2 more, anticipating the frigid cold to seep through, but it never came. The suit and her undergarments kept her toasty, almost too warm, in fact. She could see a humid mist forming over the inside of her helmet. She dipped her chin into the radio switch and told Solo to open her valve to let the air in. He fumbled at her collar and twisted the lever to allow the flow of air. It hissed by her ear, quite noisily, and she could feel the suit puff out around her. The overflow valve she'd screwed into the other side of the collar squealed as it opened and let out the excess pressure, preventing her suit, and her head, she suspected, from bursting. "Wait," she said, clicking on the radio. He ran back to the landing and returned with the round exercise weights. Kneeling on the last dry step, he strapped these below her knees with heavy Velcro, then looked up to see what was next. Juliet struggled to lift one foot, then the other, making sure that the weights were secure. "Wire," she said, getting the hang of working the radio. This was the most important part. The power from IT would run the lifeless pumps below. 24 volts of juice. She had installed a switch on the landing so Solo could test it while she was down there. She didn't want to travel with the wires live. Solo unspooled a dozen feet of the 2-connector wire and tied a loop around her wrist. His knots were good, both with the rope and the wire. Her confidence in the endeavor was growing by the minute, her discomfort in the suit lessening. Solo smiled down through her clear plastic dome from 2 steps above, yellow teeth flashing in his scraggly beard. Juliet returned the smile. She stood still while he fumbled with the flashlight strapped to her helmet, clicking it on. The battery was freshly charged and would last a full day, much longer than she possibly needed. "Okay," she said. "Help me over." Releasing the radio contact with her chin, she turned and leaned against the railing, worked her belly up onto it, then eased her head over. It was an incredible sensation, throwing herself over that rail. It felt suicidal. This was the great stairwell. This was her silo. She was 4 levels up from mechanical, all that space below her, that long plummet only madmen dove into, and she was going just as willingly. Solo helped with her weighted feet. He splashed down onto the first wet step to assist her. Juliet threw her leg over the railing as he lifted. Suddenly, she was straddling that narrow bar of slippery steel, wondering if the water would truly hold her, if it would catch and slow her fall. And there was a moment of raw panic, the taste of metal in her mouth, the sinking of her stomach, and the dire need to urinate, all while Solo heaved her other foot over the railing, her gloved hands clawing madly for the rope he'd tied, her boots splashing noisily and violently into the silvery skin of the flooded waters. Shit! She blew her breath out into the helmet, gasping from the shock of splashing in so quickly, her hands and knees wrapping around the twisted rope, her body moving inside the puffy suit like a layer of too large skin had become detached. "You okay?" Solo shouted, his hands cupped around his beard. She nodded, her helmet unmoving. She could feel the tug of the weights on her shins, trying to drag her down. There were a dozen things she wanted to say to Solo, reminders and tips, words of luck, but her mind was racing too fast to think of using the radio. Instead, she loosened her grip with her gloves and knees, felt the rope slide against her body with a distant squeak, and she began her long plummet down. Silo 18. Lucas sat at the little desk, constructed from an embarrassment of wood, and stared down at a book stuffed with a fortune in crisp paper. The chair beneath him was probably worth more than he'd make in a lifetime, and he was sitting on it. If he moved, the joints of the dainty thing twisted and squeaked, like it could come apart at any moment. He kept his boots firmly planted on either side, his weight on his toes, just in case. Lucas flipped a page, pretending to read. It wasn't that he didn't want to be reading, he just didn't want to be reading this. Entire shelves of more interesting work seemed to mock him from within their tin boxes. They sang out to be perused, for him to put away the order, with its rigid writing, bulleted lists, an internal labyrinth of page references that led in more circles than the great stairwell itself. Each entry in the order pointed to another page, every page another entry. Lucas flipped through a few and wondered if Bernard was keeping tabs on him. The head of IT sat on the other side of the small study, just one room of many in the well-stocked hideaway beneath the servers. While Lucas pretended to shadow for his new job, Bernard alternated between fiddling with the small computer on the other desk and going over to the radio mounted on the wall to give instructions to the security forces in the down deep. Lucas pinched a thick chunk of the order and flopped it to the side. He skipped past all the recipes for averting silo disasters and checked out some of the more academic reference material toward the back. This stuff was even more frightening. Chapters on group persuasion, on mind control, on the effects of fear on upbringing, graphs and tables dealing with population growth. He couldn't take it. He adjusted his chair and watched Bernard for a while as the head of IT and acting mayor scrolled through screen after screen of text, his head notching back and forth as he scanned the words there. After a moment, Lucas dared to break the silence. "Hey, Bernard?"
"Huh?"
"Hey, why isn't there anything in here about how all this came to be?" Bernard's office chair squealed as he swiveled it around to face Lucas.
"I'm sorry, what?"
"The people who made all this, the people who wrote these books, why isn't there anything in the order about them? Like how they built all this stuff in the first place?"
"Why would there be?"
Bernard half turned back to his computer. "So we would know? I don't know, like all the stuff in the other books."
I don't want you reading those other books. Not yet.
Bernard pointed to the wooden desk.
Learn the order first. If you can't keep the silo together, the legacy books are pulp. They're as good as processed wood, if no one's around to read them.
Nobody can read them but the two of us if they stay locked up down here.
No one alive. Not today. But one day there'll be plenty of people who will read them. But only if you study.
Bernard nodded toward the thick and dreadful book before turning back to his keyboard and reaching for his mouse. Lucas sat there a while, staring at Bernard's back, the knotted cord of his master keys sticking out of the top of his undershirt. I figure they must have known it was coming, Lucas said, unable to stop himself from perseverating about it. He had always wondered about these things, had suppressed them, had found his thrills in piecing together the distant stars that were so far away as to be immune to the hillside taboos. And now he lived in this vacuum, this hollow of the silo no one knew about, where forbidden topics didn't dare tread, and he had access to a man who seemed to know the precious truth.
You aren't studying,
Bernard said. His head remained bent over his keyboard, but he seemed to know Lucas was watching him. But they had to have seen it coming, right? Lucas lifted his chair and turned it around a little more. I mean, to have built all these silos before it got so bad out there? Bernard turned his head to the side, his jaw clenching and unclenching. His hand fell away from the mouse and came up to smooth his mustache.
These are the things you want to know? How it happened?
Yes, Lucas nodded. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I want to know.
Do you think it matters what happened out there?
Bernard turned and looked up at the schematics on the wall, then at Lucas.
Why would it matter?
Because it happened. And it only happened one way, and it kills me not to know. I mean, they saw it coming, right? It would take years to build all...
Decades,
Bernard said. And then move all this stuff in, all the people?
That took much less time.
So you know. Bernard nodded.
The information is stored here, but not in any of the books. And you're wrong. It doesn't matter. That's the past, and the past is not the same thing as our legacy. You'll need to learn the difference.
The difference between our past and our legacy?
Huh.
Bernard nodded. He seemed to be waiting on something. Lucas thought about the difference. For some reason, a conversation with Juliet sprang to his mind, something she was forever telling him. I think I know, he said.
Oh?
Bernard pushed his glasses up his nose and stared at him.
Tell me what you think you know.
All our hope, the accomplishments of those before us, what the world can be like, that's our legacy. Bernard's lips broke into a smile. He waved his hand to continue. And the bad things that can't be stopped, the mistakes that got us here, that's the past.
And what does this difference mean? What do you think it means?
It means we can't change what's already happened, but we can have an impact on what happens next. Bernard clapped his small hands together.
Very good.
And this... Lucas turned and rested his hand on the thick book. He continued, unbidden. The order... This is a roadmap for how to get through all the bad that's piled up between our past and the future's hope. This is the stuff we can prevent, that we can fix. Bernard raised his eyebrows at this last, as if it were a new way of looking at an old truth. Finally he smiled, his mustache curling up, his glasses rising on the wrinkled bridge of his nose.
I think you're almost ready, he said. Soon.
Bernard turned back to his computer, his hand falling to his mouse.
Very soon.
"12. Silo 17. The descent to mechanical was oddly tranquil, almost mesmerizing. Juliet slid through the green flood, fending herself off the curved railing each time the staircase spiraled around beneath her feet. The only sounds anywhere were the hiss of air entering her helmet and the excess gurgling out the other side. A never-ending stream of bubbles rolled up her visor like beads of solder, drifting up in defiance of gravity. Juliet watched these silver spheres chase one another and play like children through the metal stairs. They broke up where they touched the railing, leaving just minuscule dots of gas stuck to the surface, rolling and colliding. Others marched in wavy lines inside the stairway. They gathered in crowds beneath the hollow steps, bubbles becoming pockets of air that wobbled and caught the light radiating from the top of her helmet. It was easy to forget where she was, what she was doing. The familiar had become distorted and strange. Everything seemed magnified by the plastic dome of her visor, and it was easy to imagine that she wasn't sinking at all, but that the great stairway was rising, pushing up through the deep earth and heading toward the clouds. Even the sensation of the rope sliding through her gloved hands and across her padded belly felt more like something tugged inexorably from above, rather than a line she was descending. It wasn't until she arched her back and looked straight up that Juliet remembered how much water was stacking up above her. The green glow of the emergency lights faded to an eerie black in the space of a landing or two. The light from her flashlight barely dented it. Juliet inhaled sharply and reminded herself that she had all the air in the silo. She tried to ignore the sensation of so much liquid piled up on her shoulders, of being buried alive. If she had to, if she panicked, she could just cut the weights free. One flick with the chef's knife and she would bob right back to the surface. She told herself this as she continued to sink. Letting go of the rope with one hand, she patted for the knife, making sure it was still there.
"Slower!"
her radio barked. Juliet grabbed the rope with both hands and squeezed until she came to a stop. She reminded herself that Solo was up there, watching the air hose and electrical wires as they spooled off their neat coils. She imagined him tangled up in the lines, hopping around on one foot. Bubbles raced out of her overflow valve and jiggled through the lime water back toward the surface. She leaned her head back and watched them swirl around that taut rope, wondering what was taking him so long. In the undersides of the helical steps, the air pockets danced mercury silver, wavering in the turbulence of her passing.
"Okay,"
the radio speaker behind her neck crackled.
"Get here."
Juliet cringed from the volume of Solo's voice and wished she'd checked that before closing up her helmet. There was no fixing it now. With ears ringing and the silence and majesty of the tranquil descent broken, she slid down another level, keeping her pace steady and slow as she studied the slack in the wire and the air hose for any sign of their pulling taut. As she passed close to the landing of 139, she saw that one of the doors was missing. The other door had been wrenched violently on its hinges. The entire level must be flooded, which meant more water for the pumps to move. Just before the landing rose out of sight, she saw dark forms down the corridor, shadows floating in the water. The flashlight on her helmet barely illuminated a pale and bloated face before she drifted past, leaving the long dead to rise out of sight. It hadn't occurred to Juliet that she might come across more bodies. Not the drowned, of course. The flood would have risen too slowly to take anyone by surprise. But any violence that occurred in the down deep would now be preserved in its icy depths. The chill of the water around her seemed to finally penetrate the layers of her suit. Or perhaps it was just her imagination. Her boots thumped to the lowermost floor of the stairwell while she was still looking up, keeping an eye on the slack in the lines. Her knees were jarred by the startling end to her descent. It had taken her far less time than a dry hike would have. With a grip on the rope for balance, Juliet let go with her other hand and waved it through the thick atmosphere of green groundwater. She dipped her chin against the radio switch. "I'm down," she transmitted to Solo. She took a few lumbering and tentative steps, waving her arms and half swimming toward the entrance to mechanical. The light from the stairwell barely penetrated past the security gates. Beyond, the oily depths of a home both foreign and familiar awaited her.
"I hear you,"
Solo answered after some delay. Juliet felt her muscles tense up as his voice rattled around inside her helmet. Not being able to adjust the volume was going to drive her mad. After a dozen halting steps, she eventually got the hang of the awkward wading motion and learned to drag her weighted boots across the steel decking. With the suit inflated and her arms and legs brushing around on the inside, it was like guiding a bubble by throwing oneself against its skin. She paused once to look back at the air hose, making sure it wasn't getting caught on the stairs, and she gave the rope she had descended one last glance. Even from this distance it appeared as an impossibly slender thread, a thread hanging in that submerged straw of a stairwell. It wavered slightly in the wake she was causing, almost as if saying goodbye. Juliet tried not to read anything into it. She turned back to the entrance to mechanical. "You don't have to do this," she reminded herself. She could hook up 2, maybe 3 more small pumps, plus a few additional runs of hydroponic piping. The work might take a few months. The water level would recede for years, but eventually those levels would be dry, and she could investigate those buried diggers Solo had told her about. It could be done with minimal risk, other than to her sanity. And if her only reason for getting back home was vengeance, if that was her only motivation, she might have chosen to wait, to take that safe route. She could feel the temptation even then to yank the weights off her boots and float up through the stairwell, to fly past the levels like she used to dream she could, arms out, buoyant and free. But Lucas had kept her apprised of the horrible mess her friends were in, the mess her leaving had caused. There was a radio mounted to his wall below the servers that leaked violence day and night. Solo's underground apartment was equipped with an identical radio, but it could only communicate with Silo 17's portables. Juliet had given up fiddling with it. A part of her was glad she couldn't hear. She didn't want to have to listen to the fighting. She just wanted to get home and make it stop. This had become a desperate compulsion, returning to her silo. It was maddening to think that she was only a short walk away, but those doors were only ever open to kill people. And what good would her return do anyway? Would her surviving a cleaning and revealing the truth be enough to expose Bernard and all of IT? As it happened, she had other, less sane plans. It was a fantasy, maybe, but it gave her hope. She dreamed of fixing up one of the diggers that built this place, a machine buried and hidden at the long end of its vertical toil, and driving it through the earth itself to 18s down deep. She dreamed of breaking that blockade, of leading her people back to these dry corridors and getting this dead place working again. She dreamed of operating a silo without all the lies and deceptions. Juliet waded through the heavy water toward the security gate, dreaming these childish dreams, discovering that they somehow steeled her resolve. She approached the security turnstile and saw that the lifeless and unguarded gate would pose the first true obstacle of her descent. Getting over it wouldn't be easy. Turning her back to the machine, she placed her hands on either side and pushed, squirming and kicking her heavy heels against the low wall until she was just barely sitting on the control box. Her legs were too heavy to lift. Not high enough to swing over, anyway. The weights had ended up being more than she'd needed to counter the suit's buoyancy. She wiggled backwards until her butt was more secure and tried to turn sideways. With a thick glove under her knee, she strained and leaned back until her boot was on the edge of the wall. She rested a moment, breathing hard and filling her helmet with muffled laughter. It felt ridiculous, all this effort to do something so outrageously simple, so benign. With one boot already up, the other was easier to lift. She felt the muscles in her abdomen and thighs, muscles sore from weeks of a porter's hustle, finally help her lift her own damn foot up. She shook her head in relief, sweat trickling down the back of her neck, already dreading repeating the maneuver on the return trip. Dropping to the other side was easy. The weights did all the work. She took a moment to make sure the wires knotted around her wrist and the air hose attached to her collar weren't getting tangled, and then started down the main corridor, the flashlight on the top of her helmet, her only illumination.
You okay?
Solo asked, his voice startling her again.
I'm fine.
She held her chin down against her chest, leaving the contact open.
I'll check in if I need you. The volume is a little high down here. It scares the hell out of me.
She released the contact and turned to see how her lifeline was doing. All along the ceiling, her overflow bubbles danced in the glow of her flashlight like tiny jewels.
Okay, gotcha.
God damn it, she muttered, wishing she could reach inside her helmet to adjust the thing or to dig a finger in her ear. It felt like his voice was still lodged in there, tickling her. With her boots hardly leaving the floor, pushing forward on them one at a time, she slowly made her way across the main intersection and past the mess hall. To her left, if she made her way down the hallway and took 2 turns, she could reach Walker's workshop. Had it always been a workshop? She had no idea. In this place, it might be a storeroom, or an apartment. Her small apartment would be in the opposite direction. She turned to peer down that hallway, her cone of light brushing away the darkness to reveal a body pressed up against the ceiling, tangled in the runs of pipe and conduit. She looked away. It was easy to imagine that being George or Scotty or someone else she cared about and lost. It was easy to imagine it being herself. She shuffled toward the access stairs, her body wavering in the thick but crystal clear water, the weight of her boots and the buoyancy of her torso keeping her upright even though she felt on the verge of toppling. She paused at the top of the square steps leading down.
I'm about to descend,
she said, chin down.
Make sure you keep everything feeding, and please don't respond unless there's a problem. My ears are still ringing from the last time.
Juliet lifted her chin from the contact switch and took the first few steps, waiting for Solo to blare something in her ear, but it never came. She kept a firm grip on the wire and hose, dragging it around the sharp corners of the square stairwell as she descended into the darkness. The black water all around was disturbed only by her rising bubbles and the feeble cone of her sweeping, flashlit gaze. 6 floors down, the hose and wire became difficult to pull, too much friction from the steps. She stopped and gathered more and more of it around herself. letting the slack coil and drift in the weightlessness of the water. Several of her careful splices in both the wire and tubing slid through her gloves. She paused and checked the taped and adhesed joints of the ladder to see how they were holding up. Minuscule bubbles were trailing out of one joint. They left a perforated and wavy line of tiny dots in the dark water. It was hardly anything. Once she had enough slack at the bottom of the stairs to reach the sump basin, she turned and marched purposefully toward her work. The hardest part was over. The air was flowing in, cool and fresh and hissing by her ear. The excess streamed out through the other valve, the bubbles shooting up in a curtain whenever she turned her head. She had enough wire and hose to reach her goal, and all of her tools intact. It felt like she could finally relax now that she knew she wouldn't be going any deeper. All she had to do was hook up the power lines, 2 easy connections, and make her way out. Being so close, she dared to think of getting free, of rescuing this silo's mechanical spaces, resuscitating one of its generators and then one of its hidden and buried diggers. They were making progress. She was on her way to rescuing her friends. It all seemed perfectly attainable, practically in her grasp after weeks of frustrating setbacks. Juliet found the sump room just where it was supposed to be. She slid her boots to the edge of the pit in the center. Leaning forward, her flashlight shone down on the numbers signifying how deep the waters had risen. They seemed comical under so many hundreds of feet of water. Comical and sad. This silo had failed its people. But then Juliet corrected herself. These people had failed their silo.
Solo, I'm at the pump. Gonna hook up the power.
She peered down at the bottom of the pit to make sure the pump's pickup was clear of debris. The water down there was amazingly clear. All the oil and grime she'd worked hip-deep in at the bottom of her own basin had been made diffuse, spread out into who knew how many gallons of groundwater seepage. The result was crystal clear stuff she could probably drink. She shivered, suddenly aware that the chill of the deep water was making its way through her layers and wicking away her body heat. Halfway there, she told herself. She moved toward the massive pump mounted on the wall. Pipes as thick as her waist bent to the ground and snaked over the edge of the pit. The overflow ran up the wall in a similarly sized pipe and joined the jumble of mechanical runs above. As she stood by the large pump and worked the knotted wires off her wrist, she remembered the last job she'd ever performed as a mechanic. She had pulled the shaft on an identical pump and had discovered a worn and broken impeller. As she selected a Phillips driver from her pocket and began loosening the positive power terminal, she took the time to pray that this pump had not been in a similar condition when the power had blown. She didn't want to have to come down and service it again. Not until she could do it while keeping her boots dry. The positive power line came free easier than she had hoped. Juliet twisted the new one into place. The sound of her own breathing rattled in the confines of her helmet and provided her only company. As she was tightening the terminal around the new wire, she realized she could hear her breathing because the air was no longer hissing by her cheek. Juliet froze. She tapped the plastic dome by her ear and saw that the overflow bubbles were still leaking out, but slower now. The pressure was still inside her suit. There just wasn't any more air being forced inside. She dipped her chin against the switch, could feel the sweat form around her collar and drip down the side of her jaw. Her feet were somehow freezing, while from the neck up she was beginning to sweat.
Solo, this is Juliet. Can you hear me? What's going on up there?
She waited, turned to aim her flashlight down the air hose and looked for any sign of a kink. She still had air, the air in her suit. Why wasn't he responding?
Hello, Solo, please say something.
The flashlight on her helmet needed to be adjusted, but she could feel the ticking of some silent clock in her head. How much air would she have starting right then? It had probably taken her an hour to get down there. Solo would fix the compressor before her air ran out. She had plenty of time. Maybe he was gassing it up. Plenty of time, she told herself, as the driver slipped off the negative terminal. The damn thing was stuck. This she didn't have time for, not for anything to be corroded. The positive wire was already spliced and locked tight. She tried to adjust the flashlight strapped to her helmet. It was aimed too high. Good for walking, horrible for working. She was able to twist it a little and aim it at the large pump. The ground wire could be connected to any part of the main housing, right? She tried to remember. The entire case was the ground, wasn't it? Or was it? Why couldn't she remember? Why was it suddenly difficult to think? She straightened the end of the black wire and tried to give the loose copper strands a twist with her heavily padded fingers. She jabbed this bundle of raw copper into a cowling vent on the back, a piece of conducting metal that appeared connected to the rest of the pump. She twisted the wire around a small bolt, knocked the slack so it would hold, and tried to convince herself that this would work, that it would be enough to run the damn thing. Walker would know. Where the hell was he when she needed him? The radio by her neck squawked, a burst and pop of static, what sounded like part of her name in a faraway distance, a dead hiss, and then nothing. Juliet wavered in the dark, cold water. Her ears were ringing from the outburst. She dipped her chin to tell Solo to hold the radio away from his mouth, when she noticed through the glass window of her helmet's visor that there were no more bubbles spilling from the overflow valve and rising in that gentle curtain across her vision. The pressure in her suit was gone. A different sort of pressure quickly took its place.